Before a guy named Mendeleev, we had alchemists, and we had a variety of rules of things that worked with chemistry, but nothing that really put it all together. And Mendeleev came up with the periodic table of elements. He set up the structure to the rules, so we had sort of a collection of known practices in terms of the ways that alchemists would function, right? So alchemists are not really chemists; they're sort of mystics that would figure out some things that could work and could make some weird chemicals mixed together, and they sort of had these notions of practice, but they didn't really have a science. They didn't have a structure to the way that they were putting all of their stuff together. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the way that game design, we have kind of the same boat. We're kind of in the alchemist stage of game design. And we'll look at some of the things and the best practices that exist, but we don't really have a periodic table of elements. That we don't have a collection of things that says, here are the 8 things that you need to do to make a game do this kind of thing for you. We have a lot of good ideas in that regard, but we don't really have a fundamental theory of what game design is and how to explore player experience. We don't even necessarily have a good definition of what a game is, for that matter. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is coming from this book here, a book of The Art of Game Design, a book of lenses by Jesse Schell. I recommend checking out this book. I also recommend checking out almost any lecture you ever find online by Jesse Schell. He's a great speaker. He's a lot of fun just to listen to when he gives a presentation. But beyond that, he's got a lot of great ideas about the way games work, and he continues to be a game developer, exploring a lot of interesting and innovative spaces. He's actually pushing the boundaries on educational games as well as entertainment games and mixing the two. But a lot of the ideas and the concepts and sort of the structure of this lecture are things that are coming out of this book. But of course, this book isn't necessary for this class, and we're really only doing it for just this one week. So before we get too far into it, we need to know what is a game designer, right? Or who is the game designer? And really, although there's a role in particular for a game designer at a company, there's often a creative director and a lead designer and all that. Really, anyone that makes a decision that is going to impact the player experience is a game designer and has some value added to the whole game design process. And so that ends up being quite a few people. So even though you might be a widget programmer or you might be an artist modeling rocks, you still are making decisions that will impact the player's experience to some degree or another based on the way that you fill in the tasks that you're doing. It's kind of important to understand that because, one, you get better paid and you get a more stable job if you are either a game artist or a game programmer than a game designer. There's also very few game designer jobs that are strictly game design. And so it's good to be able to work in sort of both areas and to understand that you can actually make an impact as a programmer or as an artist in the field without necessarily having the title game designer. And you can always potentially evolve into being just a strict game designer as you age within the field and show off your skills that way. So that quote above, I became a game designer to create joy, reflects this idea that your impact in the art or the programming or even the game design of the level layout all work to create the joy in the player, to modify their experience, to evolve, to evoke the joy out of the experience. So we'll talk about the business structure at another point, but this is a team. I believe this is the Skyrim team, or this one portion of the Skyrim team. I'm not sure. There's been so many versions of Skyrim that it's hard to say. This is probably the original Skyrim team, but teams are large, especially on these very large games, and so there's a lot of specialization that happens, and there will be a different lecture to talk about the business of games and the kinds of roles that you would take on. But at the base level, besides sound and acting, say, really the two main aspects of any game that you see ever are programming and art, right? And so we've kind of explored a lot of those in various ways, mostly on the technical side in this class. But that's a large portion of it, right? Usually it's a large team of artists, a large team of programmers, and then you have some storytellers, you have some producers who work with actual voice actors, or just you get Foley effects artists, a few of those to create the sound effects throughout, and of course musicians and so on to create the music. But the majority of the team, large portions of the team, are really built around the art and the programming, the various pieces of art, especially the animation versus the modeling versus the rigging versus the environment artists that specialize in those areas. And of course, even with programming, you've got gameplay programmers and graphics programmers and deep engine programmers who work on primarily on storage, or even the network programmers. So a lot of specialization happens, but again, all of the decisions that go into that process make a final game experience. So hopefully you have a vision, you have a visionary, a creative director, when you've got a team as large that helps to organize and focus that vision so that you get something that's cohesive rather than 100 people's different idea of joy. But you do get bits and pieces of that joy pulling out from everyone that's involved. Okay, so we've talked about a game designer, but what is the game? In a sense, the game is not the experience, right? The game is an artifact, and the experience is what's happening inside the player's head. You might imagine that if there was a way for us to inject an experience, the experience of overcoming some massive obstacle or becoming a starfighter pilot, that we could skip the game entirely and just inject those experiences into someone's head, and that would take the place of games as we have them. And we're evolving that direction, right? We see VR and things like that, and we imagine the holodeck. The holodeck from Star Trek is always considered, kind of the penultimate entertainment medium, but there's probably one beyond that, right? So the holodeck, you get to sort of suddenly become this character, and you actually experience being, Sherlock Holmes or Achilles in the Hellenic Wars, or any number of heroic stories, right? Odysseus and so on. And so that's maybe a further step, but of course, if you just simply took control of a person's mind and did maybe the total recall thing, and they just are that. They have a memory as though they actually were that person. And you just inject that entire experience in their head. Maybe games go away entirely, right? But until that time, we have a game which is an artifact, which is meant to evoke a certain experience within the player's head, but it's going to evoke different kinds of experiences depending on how the player approaches it, or what experience they bring to it, and how that evolves as they play the game. And so there's a certain level of missing the cues, or just some almost a collaboration between the design experience versus the play experience. And it's worth understanding that the game itself is simply an artifact, but that the experience that's evolved is unique to each player. And so as we understand this idea of experience, it's hard to pull that out, right? And so there's this interesting lecture by David Foster Wallace that I've linked here, and there will be a link in among the media as well. But the story that he pulls out of there at the beginning is interesting for our purposes here, which is that there are two fish swimming through the water, and this older wiser fish comes swimming through by the two younger fish, and he says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And he goes on, and the one fish looks to the other and says, "What's water?" The idea is that the older fish is actually sort of aware of the experience of the water, and the two younger fish, it's so obvious that it's hard to actually separate themselves from the fact that they exist within water. And so in many ways, experience, the kinds of experience that we want to evoke are just living experiences, and so it's hard to separate ourselves from the experience that we want to evoke. We can think of certainly things that are completely foreign to us, like the idea of being, say, a soldier in Sparta, or a spaceship captain. Some of these things are impossible to experience in real life, and so they're sort of easier maybe to think about as a fantasy, but maybe not as maybe not as realistic if you're so fantastical that you well divorced of sort of common experience. And so it's worth kind of taking a step back and understanding what your human experience is, so that you can understand which pieces of that are worth actually capturing within a game. And everybody sort of has their own unique experience in life, and in some sense has something to say that they could say in a gameplay experience that they could have somebody else live through. So there's a few notes here taken from again Jesse Schell's book on ways to think about that. And this is the way to start capturing your experience, to understand what it is you are seeing and feeling in a way that you can communicate to at least yourself, and then start to communicate to a team, and then potentially, as the team understands it, communicate that to a player so that they actually live through it. So we look at inspiration and preparation. We have now 40 odd years of games that we can work with to actually get inspiration from. But it's not just meant to be inspiration from games. So unfortunately, if all you do is play games, especially if all you do is play first-person shooter games, then your level of inspiration may be stuck at the realm of, well, I'm just going to make my bullets reload faster. I'm going to make it slightly easier to point and shoot. Or I'm going to do slight modification to the way I shoot, right? And those aren't quite as exciting as they could be if you not only play first-person shooters, but also go mountain climbing. And I'm going to reflect back on the history lecture where we talked about the very first game, Cave Story, actually being a representation of spelunking, and the fact that the developer's wife was a avid caver, and he went along with her, and he was trying to connect with his daughter by essentially recreating the experience of caving. And so it was a real life experience that they were going after. And so it's not just playing games, but living your life that provides the inspiration. And then the preparation is examining it, right? So it's not just playing it once. It's not just doing the experience. It's certainly worth having the experience in the first place, saying that was amazing, that was awesome, I loved that game. But then it's coming back to and understanding what it is about that game that you liked, pulling it apart, dissecting it, understanding where it came from, what parts of that are good, what parts of that are bad, what parts of it are necessary to be considered core to the experience, and what parts are kind of superfluous. And then the incubation and insight, these are where you start to just think about things, right? So you let it sit, you let it simmer, you go for a drive, or you take a shower, and your thoughts just sort of come to you. And that's the incubation period. So you spent plenty of time studying. This is a good way to study in general, that you sort of take in a whole lot of information, but then you also give your brain time to collect and collate and sleep on it, to just work idly in the background with a lot of the ideas that you're seeing. And you come to an insight, a sort of aha moment that says, this is a thing. This is a thing that I haven't seen. This is a new way of looking at this thing that I could do something with. And so incubation leads directly to insight, and then the evaluation says that you not just take the moment that you get the aha and say, that's it, that's what I'm doing, but you kind of sit on it, and you actually like measure your own aha moment, right? So lots of people have ideas, right? And just by playing games and sitting around, you go, oh, what'd be great is if this happened, right? And unfortunately, a lot of ideas are terrible. And so the thing to do is kind of learn to cultivate your own ideas. And one of the things that happens is, one, that some ideas will seem really hot and exciting the first time you think about them, and then you'll kind of spend some time and it's like, I'm over that idea. But then there's other ones that you try to put them aside. You try to say, that was a really cool idea, and but I'm pretty sure it's not going to work out. And yet, in the back of your head, it starts creeping back in, right? You hear something else, and suddenly this whole idea comes back, and you can't get rid of it, right? It's a notion that sticks in your craw, so to speak, and you need to make it, right? It needs to be evaluated. And so those are the ones where it really is, like, those are the ideas that you probably want to explore. And then you go to elaboration, where you actually start developing what that idea really means. Like, you come from the initial aha moment, you said, yeah, this one's still really got some sticky power, it's got legs, it's going to walk, let's see where it goes, right? And so now we start to elaborate on it and figure it out. So one of the things, so I've got this link at the bottom here. This is from Ira Glass, talking about the development of taste and an experience. And so it's hard to develop taste, but it's easy to start to develop the ability to get better at things, right? And so what happens a lot of times with the creative industry is that you have pretty good taste about things you like and don't like, and as you start to make your own thing, you hate everything you see because you're kind of not good at it, right? You're only just starting out, and as you start to create something, as you get that insight, as you start to evaluate it, every evaluation is going to be, this idea actually sucks, right? This is a terrible idea. And the problem is that you're new, and everybody who's new at a thing is kind of terrible at that thing. If you let your taste override it, then all you ever think is, I'm terrible and I'm not going to go any further. What you learn, or what those who are successful learn, is that the taste is the hard thing to figure out, the fact that you can figure out what's good and bad. What's then important is, if you practice and you continue to refine your ability, then your taste lets you know that you're actually getting somewhere. right? And so after a while, you start to say, this isn't actually that bad. Now there's a certain level of ego, and you're always going to kind of hate your own work, but you can always look back at where you were and where you are and say, oh, my ideas are getting better, right? And so everybody's ideas kind of suck. Everybody's first 10 games or so are probably terrible, but by the 10th game or the 11th game, if you've really put a lot of thought and practice into it, your sense of taste is still there. Your sense of the ability to look at it and say, no, this is actually pretty good, and you might actually be right. And so that's worth practicing. It's worth understanding that it's okay to kind of hate the things you create, as long as you keep working at it, so that you continue to improve whatever it is you hate about it. You figure out, you evaluate it honestly, and then you figure out what it is. So then if we go further and take it from the internal, how you come up with the idea, to external, how you communicate that idea, we get things like whiteboarding, where we start to get in front of a whiteboard and get the team in front of the whiteboard, and we talk about the ideas. This is where elaboration starts to really come aboard. You get to a concept drawing phase, where you're actually exploring like images of the world. And concept drawings are so important to games because they are so visual. They're both a visual art and a mechanical art, but the visual can help you understand where in the world this game will fit, and how it will feel in terms of the coloring, the mood, and so on, the tone of the actual artwork, as well as give you a sense for the kinds of experiences that can be had, right? So there are early concept drawings of, say, some of the more modern Lara Croft games, where you see Lara Croft in like a massive jungle, and you get the sense that she's overwhelmed by this jungle, and it's both an exploration and a survival game. And so you can get some of that experience from the concept drawing itself very early on in the whole design process, simply by having a very good concept drawing of the thing. And then we go into design document, where we will discuss this further. To some degree, the kind of the dirty secret is that design documents really aren't built to the degree that they are discussed in, say, academia. And so we're going to build a version of design documents for this class especially, that do walk through some of the ideas, the core elements, and the pieces that are necessary, including especially the pieces that are necessary when you're making a pitch, especially to potential investors, theoretical investors in this case, but someday hopefully real investors that you'd want to convince to put money into your idea. But there usually is a design document to some degree, because you need to communicate the real formal description of, this is what we kind of decided was the game, based on these concept drawings. But then the prototype is what sells it, right? So between the concept drawing, the design document, the prototype, that's really where you get the full concept. So the prototype will be core elements. It won't look anything like the game is supposed to, but it will actually give you like one of the core experiences. So if you imagine Mario, where you're jumping and breaking blocks, you might have a prototype which is simply a level where you can just jump and break a whole bunch of blocks, and you get a sense for how fun it is to bash Mario's head into blocks and mess those up. And maybe you can throw some enemies in, and you squish those too. So you're bashing blocks with the top of your head, and you're squishing enemies with the bottom of your feet. And just that by itself, just playing a game like that, you're probably going to experience all of the fun that you'd have from Mario. And the design document helps you elaborate where that's going to go. It's going to say, we're going to have 8 worlds, and we're going to evolve the enemies over time. We're going to have these kinds of enemies. Here's a bunch of the ideas for enemies so far, and here's a concept drawing of how it's actually going to look, because this little prototype that we had was all just blocks and squares being squished and moved around, much like we've done in this class in terms of the things that we've built. And then the playtesting, once you have a prototype, especially early on and even throughout the entire game, the playtesting tells you how people are experiencing the game. So every game teaches you how to play it. Every game you get better at, and the more you are into the game, the less you are able to experience the game correctly, or sort of too into the game. And so playtesting is so important to pull you away from your baby and see how it actually works when other people see it. Okay, so some ideas for designers. Carry a notebook. Start being able to put your ideas down. Whether it's various parts of the things that you've learned about a game, ideas you've had about your own game, things you liked about something else, things you've overheard that other people didn't like about other games, just various experiences that you've had or have that are worth jotting down, in the sense that they might be kind of interesting, right? Like I had this really, you journal basically and say, oh, today was a good day. And maybe there's something out of that that you could pull apart and say, this is something I think I could turn into a game. And then you actually practice creativity. So creativity can happen in a number of ways. One of the ways that you could do it with game design is simply by sharing your ideas and talking to people and you know elaborating on someone else's idea, allowing other people to elaborate on your idea without necessarily losing control of your idea. People will gladly say, oh, you should do such and such. And it's worth hearing that out. So the next line, listen deeply, means you don't necessarily need to turn people off if they're saying, oh, you should do such and such. And you're like, that's a terrible idea. It doesn't hurt to keep that in the back of your head, to actually hear what they say, understand what they're saying, and then maybe still ignore it. But it might also be like, oh no, there's a nugget of some interesting things that person said about my game, even though it's my game, and they did it, and you turn it into your own kind of thing. Listening is, there's a great quote here: to listen with a silent heart, the waiting open soul, without passion, without desire, without judgment, without rebuke. You simply hear what's happening, right? You're willing to accept that you don't like what you're going to hear. You're willing to accept that it's not necessarily what you want to hear, but it's worth hearing because you can do something with it. If you understand what it is you're hearing, you can very safely ignore it if you're like, no, I really understand what I heard and it really isn't for my game. Or, no, I'm hearing that and I'm understanding it. It's especially important to listen to your team, who, if you are the creative director, you need to understand what they're saying to you about either the technical limitations or just the way the game feels, because you're going to be close to it in a way that they aren't, and they're going to come to you with different experiences. And then your audience will have ideas. And of course, game players will have weird ideas about things. As a game designer, you will start to learn that your ideas as a game player are completely different and don't really make sense in a lot of ways. The ways that you experience the game can't really evolve or can't be evoked in the way you think. And then sometimes the audience is right because they do play a lot of games, and so they do know what they like and they don't like. And so it's worth listening again to understand what's there and whether or not which pieces are worth pulling out and which pieces might be safely ignored and so on. The game itself will have something to say. When you play the game, you have to, as much as you can, come to it with an open soul every time, right? When you play test your game, you have to start it as though it's the first time you ever saw it, and really feel out every click and every motion of the mouse or the keyboard or the joystick or whatever it is you're using to play, and put those all together and understand how they play together and how the game works, and so on. You need to listen to your client. You need to even listen to yourself and figure out where the good and bad parts are, and again, to the point where you're hearing things you don't necessarily want to hear, but that you need to address in some way. Learn how to do the rest comes back to everything we're doing in this class, especially. It's understanding how games are made, how all the parts work together, because you can't make a game if you don't understand how they actually go. You can't really make games if you don't play games as a game designer. In the same way that there's no musician who makes music without ever listening to other music. There's no author that writes books without really ever reading other books. There are no game designers who make games that aren't playing other games. You need to do other things, as we already talked about. You need to have other experiences than games, like books and like music. But you also need to understand all the parts of the game, right? You need to understand what is technically feasible, what is artistically feasible, what's kind of ridiculous, right? A lot of people think that MMOs are super easy to make and all you have to do is just do a lot of stuff, but doing a lot of stuff is really hard, and putting in that level of detail as an artist is really hard. It takes a lot of time, so being able to understand that is important. And then develop your sense of taste. Be willing and able to kill your bad ideas, recognize your bad ideas, and let them go. Don't let them hold on to you simply because they're your idea. The ideas that you can't get rid of are the ones that are the zombie ideas are the ones that maybe you want to stick around with, but be willing to kill them early and often, because there's always more to come. There's no idea that's so amazing that it isn't worth like putting a lot of judgment to. Now we'll caveat that when we look at Ryan Clark's lecture later. But certainly, for the most part, early it's okay to kill bad ideas very early on. Okay, so let's move away from the more abstract, like what is a game designer and how do you maybe think about your experiences, to the actual artifact of the game. So the things that we're creating are the content and the dynamics. And so you can really break that down to the art and the programming. And certainly you can break down content to include sound effects and voice acting and so on. But let's just keep it with art and programming. And so there's dynamics include the physics engine and so on. But it's all the pieces that the CPU is doing. And the content are all the parts that are working. And then the mechanics end up being the kind of the way you interface with the dynamics, right? So in some sense, it's more of the experience of the dynamics and what the player is doing, versus the dynamics really being kind of a description of the code itself, right? And so that's where it's also less visible. So the dynamics are kind of the invisible piece that the programmer is working on that ends up existing really only in the code, whereas the mechanics and content kind of fit in the middle layer of, well, this is what we do and what we're doing it with, right? Here's how the door looks and how we open it up. And the aesthetics is the overall feel, right? So the aesthetics gives us the artistic content. It's the ideas behind the creative director or the art lead or the art director that say that this is the way the game should feel. This is it's dark, it's moody, it's evokes these kinds of experiences. So that's really where you start to become connected exclusively with the player. The player's experience or what the designer's trying to communicate are all done at the aesthetics level. And so we can break it down and say what we're working on are the content and dynamics, but then what's experienced is the aesthetics and the mechanics. Now, of course, this is only a model, and it's a very simplified model of what's happening, but this is taken from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. As with any model, it's useful to use as a baseline to understand what it is we're doing. So it's useful to understand from the standpoint, and with any model, they're all broken, but they're also useful, right? So every model is wrong, but some models are useful. That's not my quote, but that is somebody's quote. So we can see it broken down like this. So we see the game really is just the content and dynamics, but we can't necessarily divorce the game from the player's experience. So the experience part is the aesthetics and mechanics. Mechanics, again, is kind of what the player's doing with the dynamics, and then the aesthetics are what the player's experiencing in terms of mood and gameplay and so on. And so we might divide them like this, but we can't necessarily separate them entirely because they're so intertwined in the way they feed back to each other, and the way the player's experience ends up modifying the way they interact with the content. Another way of thinking about this is that really, if we're going to divide up what it is we can directly impact and what we can indirectly impact, everything on the right is what we can directly impact. We can change the content, we can change the dynamics, we can change the programming. We can't necessarily directly impact what the mechanics the player will interact with or what their aesthetic experience will be. And that's where we kind of get this breakdown between what it is we're building, which is the thing on the right, versus what ends up in the player's head. So we can look at this. I've shown this screenshot probably a couple times now within this class, but in this case, I want to look at it as breaking down this content versus mechanics and so on. So in terms of the content, we see quite a few models, right, and quite a few particle effects. We see the particle, this total VFX package right here. We see quite a few 3D models which represent these spaceships that are flying in to attack the Zerg base. We see the Zerg's base models over here, or Protoss base actually. We see the Protoss collectors down here, the models of those, the fact that they're collecting. And so we see a whole lot of content and color choices and modeling choices and so on in terms of the content that we're seeing, the visual representation of the game. We also can infer quite a few mechanics. So we see the resource collection that's happening here, both in terms of the crystals and the gas. We also see some of the combat mechanics that are starting to happen, like the fact that these guys are shooting the characters over here. We see that the whole group is being maneuvered in through interaction by the player. We don't necessarily see that, but we know that that's what's happening. The players sort of gathered this entire group and moved in his army. And so those are all piece of the dynamics, and then from the mechanical side, we get the player's experience of what's actually happening. Like there is an attack happening, there's a massive army that's going into the base. One player feels a sense of accomplishment of having snuck in this massive force to annihilate the base, although not so much because there are a few spaceships up here that are looking to defend the base. And the other player might be experiencing a sense of fear at having this this large army right at the edge of their base there, as they're dealing with the mechanics and trying to figure out how to maneuver their armies over and all that. If we think back to user interface, they're probably not thinking necessarily in terms of all the clicks and so on. They're probably thinking at the level of, I need to build up some more forces, or I need to start thinking about having a second base, or I need to just even move the armies from here to there to balance against this threat that's coming in, right? And so that's at the mechanical level, and then the aesthetic level is the whole thing, right? The sort of elation and defeat and so on that are happening, as well as the bright colors and the sort of somewhat cartoony but also serious nature of the attack. The fact that they're sort of bright and cartoony colors, high contrast, well-defined, well-shaped out silhouettes, partially because the well-defined and well-shaped out silhouettes make it easier to recognize and use the pieces, much like we all recognize chess pieces for their shape, but also because it's the aesthetic that they were going for. And so we can see that as well in this, and some of the experience that both players are having in terms of the good and the bad of the situation that they're in. So given this perspective of kind of the artifacts of the game versus the experience, then we need some way that the player is going to interact with it. So we think about that in terms of an interface, right? So the player will perform actions, and then the system will respond to those actions and provide some kind of feedback. So we talked about this, to some degree with user interfaces, and we've seen some of the similar kinds of things that happen with AI, and so it's similar for the player, but we have maybe more and less control in terms of what we're doing. So a lot of what we're trying to control is what the player can do, but we don't really know what they're going to do, right? So they still choose actions. We give them the option for the actions, and we give them feedback in the way that we think will help them understand what it is they're seeing. But this is kind of the sort of narrow pipeline that we have to actually manage the way the player is going to experience our content, as through the actions and feedback. And as a reminder, all of this is kind of the way to think about this is as a guidepost for the language, right? So we're starting to try to develop a grammar or a periodic table, but the idea here is that you can start to build a vocabulary to help you speak through the parts of the game design process that you want to target, or that you're currently working on, or that your game design document elaborates, those kinds of things. So really that's the way to be thinking about this at any time, not some kind of prescriptive model for you need to define some actions or some feedback. It's really we're kind of coming up with a vocabulary that we're going to use to build around our game design. So now as we'll move into more of the concrete makeup of what defines a game, right? Again, we're still talking in terms of vocabulary. We've actually looked at like the concrete processes that we use to build games, or the technologies. But let's look a little bit less abstract and more into what constructs them. And so in the first place, we have all games have a rule set and a structure, where it turns out that in real life, and this is sort of the reason that we enjoy playing games, in real life we have unclear boundaries, we have fuzzy boundaries. And in fact, the book Reality is Broken by Jane McGonigal goes into in depth on this in terms of the ways that reality doesn't really give us clear feedback or really define the rules in the ways we'd like. Interpersonal relationships, how to succeed in life, how your career will go, all these kinds of things aren't really very clear, and you don't necessarily get clear progress. And so if there's a way that you can go through and start to measure and define rule sets, then maybe you can improve your own reality, right? And so that's kind of her thesis in her book. But coming back to games as a proper, we have a rule set, and we enjoy being sort of confined into these rules because it gives us a well-defined space in which to play, whether we're playing a game by ourselves and just marking our progress and seeing that, or if we're agreeing to a set of rules with another person or multiple people, we can come together at the board game and agree to start playing and abiding by those rules together. It both gives us a common ground to work from. It gives us a sort of a camaraderie, even though we're maybe opponents, that we're both kind of agreeing to play by the rules. And so this is a good point in which to begin, because this is kind of the core element that gives us a part of our joy in playing the games. So when we think about frames of reference, this is really this is a way of thinking about what's going on in the player's head as they are approaching the game and coming into the game. So sort of the outermost scope frame of reference is that this is a game, right? And then as you start to bury in, you say, well, I'm a superhero in a world where I'm trying to save things, or I'm currently on a mission where I am trying to stop the robbers from breaking into the bank. And so there are multiple frames of reference and sometimes embedded frames of reference, but it helps us to understand from where, or to kind of delineate where the player is coming in from. We're all starting from, we are here to play a game, and then it also develops into what how well does the player understand the mode. So for instance, when a player first comes to a game, they actually don't likely know many of the modes that they're going to be playing within. So there's a tutorial segment that, again, most players are going to be familiar with at least that concept. They're going to learn a tutorial, but then the tutorial is meant to introduce the various frames that will occur, right? The gameplay elements that will occur. You will have missions, and you will have a base mode where you can build up your base in between missions and things like that, so you can understand the kind of the rules of each frame and how you exist within those frames, and that then the player has some expectations of moving between those frames, and that there are limits to how much those rules might be violated, right? So your base is usually not a place where you end up fighting, for instance, and you kind of get a rest mode there or something. Now, games will sometimes violate this for effect. One of my favorite ways of violating the most fundamental form of this as a game was in the game Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem here, where the player is controlling a character who's going through some psychological experience in I think a sanitarium or something like that. And so as their insanity meter grows, so that's one of the things that the player is supposed to manage and keep their insanity level despite the crazy things that are happening, that crazier and crazier things start to happen. The world starts to get wavy, or they start to see weird things. But if they let their insanity meter grow far enough, then Nintendo would actually start to show, or the GameCube would start to show errors that looked like all your save files were being deleted, or your machine was about to break. And so it was actually starting to violate that this is a game thing, and made it look like your GameCube was starting to break down and fall apart, right? So by way of maybe a less extreme example of violating the sort of core frame, Portal actually sets up a frame where the player is going through a series of tutorials, or lessons, I guess, level by level, very clear cut and well defined segments in which you solve puzzles and you get to the end and then you move on to the next puzzle. There is an AI that is antagonizing you the whole time, but you get into a pattern of thinking, probably that this will just carry on, and maybe you'll fight the AI at the end or something, or maybe you'll just escape the complex, right? And it turns it a little bit on its head, and there's some indications that things are not as they seem when you learn the cake is a lie, right? So the famous quote from that game, when you go into a small segment that looks like you shouldn't be able to go there, you're actually violating kind of the rules, what you think are the simulated rules of the game, because you're going through walls that you shouldn't be going through, and yet you go through there and you find that somebody has sketched out the cake is a lie, because of course the AI is promising you cake at the end when you finish all of the lessons. And so you start to learn that there is going to be a frame breaking happening, and about midway through the game, the frame is completely broken, and you're into a new frame of reference in terms of how you understand and interact with the game, which I won't spoil, but I will say that it does violate all of the previous, and you sort of have to learn as you go at that point. So it suddenly becomes the everything you've learned up to this point gives you the mechanics, but then you have to learn how to use them in this new world where everything is not clearly defined. but you are well prepared by that point. So it's not necessarily unfair in that they throw you into a new frame, but this frame changing effect can be a really strong and very memorable kind of experience. And that's one of the things that makes Portal great, is really that frame breaking that happens about the midpoint. So all said, it's important to understand the frames of reference in order to understand what the player's expectations are within those frames, but then to also understand where you can start to blur the lines and break the expectations in order to create interesting experiences for the player as a result of doing that. So objectives comes back to again, the rules and structure and some of the things that we enjoy about a game. We enjoy having a clear goal because we know exactly what we're supposed to be doing, right? A lot of times I think I find myself and I think many of my colleagues Monday morning, the first thing you have to spend an hour or so doing is maybe reading email and trying to remember what it was you were supposed to be doing, right? Because it's not clear cut. Maybe you left yourself a task list, but maybe it's not clear, and maybe your goals for the week have been changed because of some meetings that happened late last week and so on. And so again, this is a matter of real life doesn't necessarily have clear objectives, whereas video games usually do, and often it's very clear what you're supposed to be doing at any given moment. Now, it could be if you've stepped away from a game for a long time, that's no longer as clear because you've lost all the training that kind of guided you to that point. But generally speaking, being within a game, it's very clear to know what your next step is, what your next step should be. Whether or not you can succeed or not is another matter, but what you should be doing is there. So there's two categories of objectives that we can consider. One are those of endogenous values, and those of exogenous values. And this comes from biology, where endogenous means sort of within or integral to the system. And this was defined by Greg Kostikian a few years ago, or several years ago, as endogenous value in games means that it's something that helps the game to improve, right? So often you'll collect scrap or gears or other items that help you sort of improve your vehicle or your base or your character in many ways, and so that you sort of want to collect them simply because they provide value to you within the game. You feel a sense of progression. You are happy with them. Early on, a lot of games really only had a high score, and the only value there was actually exogenous. So the high score did nothing for you in the game, except that you got to put your name into a high score list, maybe in an arcade, and other people might see your name, and then you can show that off. But that's an exogenous value. That's outside the game. So you're bringing people from outside the game to show off the cool high score you got. But it doesn't mean anything in terms of what it does internal to the game, right? And so a really good example of this is there was a game called Bubsy the Cat, which came out around the same time as Sonic the Hedgehog. And Bubsy the Cat, you were a cat that had to, go through back alleys and make it to the end of the level. And you could also, as you go, collect balls of yarn to increase your score, right? But most players started to learn that there was not really much reason to collect balls of yarn unless you wanted to, show off your high score and how many balls of yarn you could collect by the end. Maybe with streaming now, you might actually find that people do that. But what they discovered is that with Bubsy, at least, and the fact that there wasn't streaming and nobody to really show off to, nobody tended to collect those balls of yarn because there wasn't any value to them other than a number that you got. Whereas with Sonic, you kind of want to collect the rings, right? So everyone who has played Sonic knows that when you get hit the first time, all the rings get knocked out of your body, right? And so you go and really quick collect more rings, or as many as you can before they disappear, because outside of your body they start fading away very quickly. And so you tend to, every time you get hit, lose some rings. And so you want to keep rings around, right? Because that's what keeps you alive. Because if you get hit and you don't have rings, then you just die, right? And you lose the game, you have to start over. And so collecting rings suddenly becomes kind of a critical thing that keeps you alive, that lets you keep playing the game. And so it's got a very strong endogenous value in that way, a very clear indication of what you want to be doing. So you don't just have objectives in terms of missions and things like that. Of course, the simplest objectives are always around the narrative and kind of completing the story and completing the game. But there are ways to look at both the objectives in terms of whether or not players will care to sort of do the side quests or not, right? Do the side quests have endogenous value? The sort of core narrative probably doesn't need to worry so much about endogenous, exogenous value, because a player is willing to play a game to at least see the narrative through, assuming there is at least that much. But often there are other things that you kind of want to have the player do as well, and so it's worth considering the words endogenous and exogenous as you're looking at those. And then as far as the whole progression meter, I'd mentioned the high score list. We have both outcomes and uncertainty, and we need to balance both of these. So outcomes really clearly states what you are going to get from completing an objective, right? And so the player both wants maybe a clear indication, or at least a somewhat clear indication of what the outcome will be by completing this mission, or completing this, collecting more rings, or what have you, by understanding the rules. So it can't be completely fuzzy, but you can have a certain amount of uncertainty there. But it's important that you have a clear outcome, because then as you achieve these goals, then you have a clearly reported progress. And again, that is part of what's exciting, what we can get joy out of a game, is to understand the rules, the objectives, and then what we're going to get as we get those objectives. Now, there is a certain amount of fun from uncertainty, right? So in a game like, say, poker, which is kind of highly uncertain in many ways, or at least a controlled uncertainty, the excitement is that you kind of know the value of the cards, you know the value of, or you know the steps at which the cards are going to be flipped over, you kind of know the frames of reference within the game. Those don't really change. You know your objective is to get the higher value of cards, but there's a lot of uncertainty about whether or not your cards are going to end up being higher than the other players. Right? And so that's a lot of where the excitement in poker comes, because while you can maybe predict all of those situations, there's still that one little nugget of uncertainty about whether or not you're going to actually win, because they might have better cards than you. It's all based on how well they can bluff and all that. And so there is a certain amount of knowing that you think you've set everything up as well as you could, but there's still a chance that you could fail, that lends itself to some excitement, as long as you don't fail maybe too often. And what's interesting is a lot of games actually have played around with that, because pure probability doesn't feel as fair as shifting probability. So there's a great article written by Jennifer Sherrill, and I'll have a link available for that, where she talks about the fact that game designers have actually stumbled upon this for quite a while, and we've actually seen a number of books published on the same topic, like Predictable Irrationality, and several others by a number of economists who have learned that people's expectation of probability is quite a bit different than reality, and their expectation of fairness is very tied to their emotional state. There's a whole field now referred to as behavioral economics around how people perceive the fairness of their income or their money, or just having a better circumstance in a game. So they'll often play small games where one person will be given $10 and the other person will be given $2, and they're still playing a betting game, and the person with, say, $10 actually feels like they deserve their position, for instance, is one of the results that was discovered. So there's many interesting results, and game designers have either stumbled on these or learned them through play tests or whatever. And Jennifer Sherrill did a research investigation where she asked many game designers that she knew what kind of tricks they used, and started discovering that there were many that she knew about, many that she didn't know about, in a variety of published games. And so the article talks about all of those. And so there's things like several shooting games. The latest Doom is one in particular where the last couple bullets actually do more damage than the first several bullets. So as you're shooting enemies, the last few bullets feel like they have a little bit more impact just before you run out of bullets. Another one is that enemies will actually tend to do less damage to you as you're lower in health. So you actually can live slightly longer if you've actually managed to lose your health down to the bare minimum, maybe fight back from the edge of chaos or whatever. And so in some cases you might feel like, well, you probably don't notice the change in probability there, but you do feel better, and you feel like you've had a better experience simply by defying the probability, the reasonable probability. Now, the one place where this breaks down
is multiplayer games. And you certainly don't want to have this kind of unfairness in, say, a standard RTS or one-on-one first-person shooter type situation. So those don't often show up in those cases. They usually only happen in single-player games or for the long campaign when you're overcoming the enemy that the designer wanted you to overcome. I heard one designer say that her job is to make it feel like she's against you, but really secretly she's on your side. And so a lot of that can be managed in terms of the outcomes and the uncertainty and all that. So moving from the game, the artifacts of the game, the elements that make up the game, there are also things that make up the player, right? And again, we're looking at sort of a model of both the player on the left, the game on the right, and the way they interact with each other, and sort of the dynamics and the flow of information back and forth through actions and feedback that both construct the game, and modify the player, modify the player's experience. And so moving back again from the game, let's move back to looking at players and understand what it is players are after, just in their own context. So another way to think about a player is think about what a player is capable of, and then what it is you want to challenge about that player, right? So we can look at the physiological breakdown of what a player is bringing to the table, and look at the ways that we want to, in some sense, like, and not antagonize, but to challenge the player to make it the thing that we want them to have to sort of deal with in our game. And we might cut crosswise in this, right? So, for instance, attention is, a person has the ability to pay attention to a certain number of things, and we see a hidden object game here where there is actually quite a few distractions, right? So with all of these distractions in place, it makes it hard to actually pick out the objects that you might care about, right? That you're trying to find, and so it's hard to actually pay attention. A lot of times, games actually draw our attention in from outside distraction, and even more so if we have a VR system that can pull our focus almost completely. But attention is one of those things that you can kind of challenge a player with. So there's maybe the core gameplay where that happens a lot is in terms of real-time strategy, or even just high strategy games. So there's a lot of things that the player has to both keep in memory as well as pay attention to, and they have to kind of keep areas of control in the back of their mind, and so it's possible for people to sneak in if the player has lost attention, right? On a certain border, maybe they started attacking a certain direction and got distracted in a different way, on their northern border, and so their southern border is actually exposed because they're not really paying as much attention to that southern border. And so strategy games are kind of the big one that actually involves attention. It doesn't really necessarily involve memory or reaction time as much, especially reaction time. You have plenty of time to think often in at least the high strategy games, the turn-based ones. But attention is maybe one of the main focuses there. So then for memory, most people can remember, say, 5 to 9 things. Often games don't challenge memory, and it's kind of interesting. Of course, there's like the card game memory where you do have to remember where things are. There's a few instances of games now that do have, say, minor memory challenges. Like the game Fall Guys has a brief game where you have the 4 change will fall out depending on which shape is the wrong one. So you actually have to use a small amount of memory, a short-term memory, to do that. And so it's kind of fun. It's mostly just that one doesn't take itself too seriously. It has a number of other challenges, a lot of built around reaction time as well. Incidentally, one genre of game that did actually require quite a bit of memory were adventure games. So they didn't track things for you, and you had to remember that say you saw a door in a certain location, or you pick up a key and you remember, oh, that door is over here, right? That kind of thing. And so so it's interesting because those games are no longer popular, but that was a case where we did see an interest in memory games, but again, not as popular. And so it's interesting because it's a gap, and it's interesting that that might be a place to sort of plumb more depths in gameplay as to what are perhaps why do people not like memory games. I'm not sure what that is. Or have we not figured out a game of testing a person's memory in a way that they would enjoy, right? Maybe it's that most people don't enjoy it, and so we do have logbooks and journals and things that keep our quests in mind and sort of do all our memory for us in many games. Keep track of all the things that are supposed to be going on in the game, so you always kind of know what's happening. But it's interesting that's maybe one that is lacking, and it would be interesting to explore why. So reaction time, then, of course, we've talked about this in a number of ways, but reaction time is the fact that humans can only react to things at, within 0.5 seconds. They can sort of build in some anticipation of the situation and try to overcome some of the surprise element. But overall, there's quite a bit of surprise, and probably most games fall in this category, right? Most games are what we would refer to as twitch, which is really a reaction challenging game. That you have to be quick, you have to be agile, you have to move fast with your mouse, you have to see and react to the situation as quickly as you can, and so it's really a game that challenges reaction. So that's maybe one of the other main focuses. So attention being the strategy games and things like that, and reaction being, say, the many of the other games that we may care about. And then all games do take into account some conditioning. They don't really challenge it necessarily. So the idea of conditioning almost comes back to the idea of user interfaces and the fact that you do want your game to become something that feels natural to the player. So you condition them to figure out how to play your game. We look at, say, Portal, where we're conditioned to figure out how to use the Portal system to solve our problems and where to look for momentum and so on. And so, and again, maybe the frame challenge that happens is a conditioning challenge as well. But I don't know that I see many games other than science experiments which might actually be of the form where they're challenging conditioning. So we've likely talked about this previously. I'll reiterate the elements of the player, the Richard Bartle's breakdown of people. So they're different. So we've talked about, players come with their frame of reference and their sort of cultural situation, right? They're however they've grown up. It's sort of the nature and nurture, right? So people have a certain level of things that are in their DNA, and they also have a certain way that they grew up, and so they bring different things to the table when they come to a game in the first place. So they'll agree that they're playing a game, they'll agree to the rules, but they'll still have different ideas about what they want to get out of life in general, as well as what they want to get out of the game. And so we come back to the hearts, clubs, diamonds, and spades, where again this is a mnemonic that helps you remember this, and the way people break down. It's based on a deck of cards, and we have hearts as socializers. They're the ones who will play either support roles or just simply want to socialize as part of the game. But they also tend to like support roles because they get to participate in the game, but they don't necessarily need to win. They want to play with other people in a way that supports everyone playing the game, because that's kind of the goal of a heart player. Clubs are what we refer to as player killers, or the harassers, the trolls. They are there to kind of interfere with other people's interest in the game. Surprisingly often, they will actually stay within the rules. So they'll agree to obey the rules, but they will use the rules against the other players as much as possible. And so in some ways, they are sort of counter to the hearts, right? They're sort of antagonistic to the people who want to kind of play with everyone else. That's sort of maybe their main focus of attack. But they'd actually, in many cases, want to work with the explorers, because the explorers know all the weird corner cases that a killer could take advantage of to destroy the game. So one instance of this is in the game Sims Online, which is really non-combative and not an issue normally, or wouldn't really support killers' play style in a normal sense. They did find a way that you could keep somebody from leaving a door simply by standing in the doorway, right? So almost literal harassment in that sense, because the game had made it so that people couldn't pass around each other, and you had to sort of move through or move around. And so all they had to do was stop in the doorway. They could trap someone inside a house, and then that person would starve to death and have all sorts of issues. So they sort of found a loophole around it by exploiting an edge case in the game itself. And so often killers will obey the rules of the game, but they will look for every loophole within those rules that they can take advantage of. Then the diamonds are the ones who simply want to master the game. The mastery is the most important piece of it. Mastering other players, of course, is another part of it, especially in a competitive game. It's not necessarily the hunter-killer where they want to antagonize another player. They simply want to overcome them, right? In fact, an achiever, a diamond, would probably be more interested in not killing noobs, whereas a hunter-killer, a player-killer, would go after the noobs simply because they want to antagonize them. Diamonds would actually rather play somebody at a top end and beat them, right? They want to figure out who's ahead of them. They'd care about the high score list and figure out, if I'm number 2, who's number 1, who am I going after? And then again, the explorers are the ones who look at the corner cases, figure out what the game is about, figure out what the rules are, ways to sort of exploit the rules simply for figuring out how it all fits together. And even in cases where the rules are kind of there, it's interesting because you'll find people kind of pushing the limits anyway, right? Just to see what happens and see what's interesting. And what's great is those are the people that you can rely on as really strong QA in many cases. The ones who will explore the edge cases and try to figure out, where the game breaks, especially. So let's move further down into what the players are experiencing. So, okay, given the context of sort of Bartle's suits and assuming that that's more or less true, then what we can assume is that people aren't going to fall directly into any one of those categories, and perhaps there are, parts of different categories that people will enjoy, right? So people will probably enjoy socializing, they will probably enjoy exploring the game, and they will probably enjoy mastering the game. So really, we can start breaking down the elements of each of those at a high level into some lower level parts that we can dissect even further to understand the experiences that the player's having, that as sort of fundamental pieces, core pieces that we can design or define at least, and then potentially also play around with in terms of our design. So mastery here in this case doesn't necessarily mean getting the best of someone else. It means that what happens in a game is that you start a game not understanding how to play it, and then you learn how to play it. You go through the tutorial, you learn how to play it, and then you start to play it more and more, and you get better and better, and you feel a sense of mastery, a sense of you've learned and accomplished something by improving your ability to play the game. And so at the very core sense, every game teaches you how to play it, and you get better and better at that. And we enjoy learning things, right? So we're kind of built in a way that we get endorphins, or we get dopamine, or one of those kinds of neurochemicals whenever we learn new things, or whenever we even get better at things that we already know, when we feel a sense of accomplishment around something that we've done. And so games exploit this, right? They give us a challenge, and they give us the tools to overcome that challenge, and then we, essentially learn and get better at a game to do that. So your goal, if you're going to tackle mastery, is to build something that the player can improve upon, that actually requires some level of skill by the player. It's not just how often they can roll the dice or how long they can wait. There's quite a few games that feel essentially random, right? That you get a random setup and then you just wait for the outcome. So war is maybe one of the worst cases of that. You actually, especially as a young kid, sort of the lesson of war, and this comes out of Jesse Schell's book again, is that you actually can't control fate. But as a young child, you might actually think you can, right? So the reality of a war is that what you're seeing, the game war, you deal a deck of cards, and the high card always kind of wins, and you just kind of play through and flip over cards as they come up. And really, it's just you are, when you're playing the game, discovering how the deck was shuffled. That's really all you're doing. There's no challenge, there's no choice, there's no skill in that game. And when you've learned that late enough in life, you stop playing that game because it's kind of silly. But as a kid, you don't know. And so as a kid, you try things, you figure out ways to grab the cards. If you watch a kid that hasn't played it, they will try to grab the cards in weird ways to figure out how to change fate. And unfortunately, the lesson is that you can't change fate. That the universe will do as it will with you, at least in terms of cards, right? Not to get too metaphysical. So I guess going back from war, there are games that are entirely random, like war. There are many games that use elements of time. So you build something, you kind of wait for it to happen, and a lot of games sort of revolve around your willingness to wait for things to happen. But there's not really skill there. It's just how long will you sit there and wait for the thing to go. So these are games that aren't going to build into mastery. But on the other hand, if you have a game where you do have some kind of choice, if you have some decision or you have some timing you need to hit, then you have something you can master. So every game will teach you something, and what you may want to go after when you're designing it is something interesting to learn, right? A skill that you actually enjoy doing. So let's take a slight divergence. One of the things that games sort of do teach you, or many games are, and by virtue of teaching you how to play that game, you learn it is complex systems. So many games are complex systems or have complex systems built in them. And the idea behind a complex system, sort of the dictionary definition, is that it's greater than the sum of its parts. So just by analyzing small pieces of it, you can't necessarily analyze the whole thing. Sort of the standard way of thinking about complex systems, or some of the standard complex systems that we know about, are things like the weather, right, and the climate. We can predict the weather for up to 5 days pretty accurately, but any further beyond that, and we start to break down. And that's because while we can measure local variables like the pressure and temperature and so on, wind speeds and whatever else, and make predictions about how that's going to apply changes down the road, we can only do so accurately up to about 5 days or so, and then we lose it because those parts don't really make up the whole. The system is more complex than that, and so small mismeasurements and things like that cause variations in the large scale. You can also, with say climate analysis and climate change, if you pick a larger scale, so rather than trying to use day by day measures, you actually use year by year or decade by decade measures. Now you can predict several decades out in kind of the same way as you might use a few days to predict the next 5 days. But it's a different scale, and it still breaks down. Beyond say 20 to 30 years, you start to lose the ability to accurately say what's going to happen. And so that's where we see some of the variability in sort of the climate prediction for the future comes from our inability to analyze much further or be entirely certain about 50 years or 100 years out. We can say broad claims about things, but we can be pretty accurate 20 to 30 years from now, given the last few years, that sort of thing. Okay, so getting out of that divergence there, games have complex systems because they have these emergent behaviors that result out of them, and those are designed, and a lot of really fun games have these kinds of complex systems because that's part of the uncertainty, that's part of the interest in playing with them, is that you don't know that this particular input is really going to make a change. You have an idea that it's going to make a certain kind of change, but the system might do something a little unpredictable, a little strange, and you just sort of discover what happens as a result of what you did to it. But you start to learn how to work within that system. You learn the nuances of that system and things that you did wrong. And so you improve. You might not ever be perfect at predicting how a game is going to turn out, and that's why we play a game. If you could perfectly predict any game, you probably wouldn't play it, right? You'd know from the first move how it's going to turn out, and it wouldn't be all that interesting to follow on and finish the game. Okay, so a lot of the power that comes from the games is our ability to experiment with them. So we are sort of living within these complex systems while we're living within a game that exhibits these emergent properties, and we understand the cause and effect relationship. What things can you do that affect other things? And you start to understand it at a deep enough and nuanced enough level that you begin to understand a complex system. Now, are you better than the predictive machines that we have? So if you were to play a game that predicts a weather system, or maybe predicts the protein folding or other kinds of things, that's hard to say. There are research projects, so I call out protein folding because there are research projects where people have essentially turned protein folding into a game and asked human beings to play the game by trying to fold proteins and essentially look for drug remedies by virtue of doing this, right, or something along those lines. And what we're unsure of is whether people have some innate ability to understand these kinds of complex systems better than maybe we could develop an algorithm for. And so if we just employ people through game-like systems like that, where they are essentially solving these predicting and solving problems at this higher level simply by interacting with the game, uh, then that's interesting, right? That humans have this sort of extra ability, but we don't really know for sure. We kind of maybe have that guess that we sort of are able to deal with that, and maybe some of the heuristics that our mind uses helps us to deal with that. But all that said, if we come back to the games that we're making, we can make very complex, interacting, involved dynamics in the game, and players will be able to deal with it to some extent. They will be able to figure out what it is they need to do to get to the end. If you give them enough experimentation and the ability to actually solve it, they will figure out a way to do it, and sometimes figure out interesting and exciting ways to do it that you didn't predict, because they will exploit the edge cases that arise. So getting back to mastery, then what we want to build into our games in order to evoke the sense of mastery is a focused rule set. So the rule set should exist within the game. It should be clear. It should be sort of a well-defined, well-bounded gameplay space. As we've already talked about, we should have well-defined rules that the player can agree that they're willing to accept. We have progress indicators with clear goals, clear outcomes, or clear indications of the uncertainty around the outcome, so that they know when things are essentially random and when they're kind of like, holding their breath against the randomness, versus when they can plan ahead and strategize and then become better and then use their skill. And it's okay to, again, have a balance, but you don't want to have too much randomness. You could potentially have no randomness, and people will enjoy that. In a certain sense, a game like chess has no uncertainty other than the other player, right? You don't really know anything. You know everything about the way the chess game is going to go, and importantly, you can't predict what the other player is going to do. And going to that way as well. So with the progress indicators, you know your outcomes. You need to know what your goals are. You need to have a clear sense of where you want to get to. And so having all of those clearly laid out in the game as part of the setup, then you are answering the call to mastery that players want to get out of the game. So this is one of my favorite pictures that I didn't find. My colleague and sometime co-teacher found this original, but it's still my absolute favorite sense of immersion. So players will come to your game initially with a willingness to see what's inside. Now, in a later lecture, we are going to talk about how to actually market a game. So I guess the assumption that players will come to your game is if they've started playing your game, then probably they're willing to come see what's inside. Getting them to come to your game in the first place means you need to entice them to come see what's inside in the first place, right? But assuming that they've come at least as far as running the executable and they've started to look at your game, then your job is to take those first, say, 10 to 15 minutes and entice them further. You start to show them the way the systems are going to work. You show them the world that they're going to be immersed in. And one of the best tricks that sort of any story or game or anything can do is what's known as, and this is for sort of the addictive quality to a game, one of the addictive qualities is to do what's known as conceal and reveal. One example of this kind of strategy is in Darksiders, the first one where you play as War, and I don't remember what the actual name is, maybe just Darksiders 1. You play the game and you immediately come in as War with all of his powers, right? And so he's a massively powerful individual. You spend the whole level just kind of dominating and moving through, and you can use every piece of power that he's got, or almost all the powers that he has. I don't think you actually get all of them. And then you get to the end and you fight some kind of big, massive boss who's much, much larger than you. Feels really good. And then they take all your powers away. In some sense, they conceal your powers and then let you start to unlock them again. And so what happens there is that you get a sense for how big and powerful War could be. But then you start with sort of the simple version of, a limited guy that can only do so much, right? And many RPG games have the same kind of sense that you know where you might be able to get to someday, and so you can see this horizon, but you only have access to so much so far. it's almost like a magic trick, right? So you show them a little bit, and then you start to hide the rest, and then you show them a little bit more, and then you hide some more. And it's tantalizing because you kind of want to unlock the mystery, right? You start to want to figure out, like, okay, well, how can I get further? How can I get more of these powers? How can I get back to where I was playing before? And this goes well with complex systems where you're kind of introduced to more and more of the game. So often games, will start you off and say, like Breath of the Wild, I think is a good example of this. You start off in a small cave, and you're very limited within the scope, and you learn a little bit about how the game's going to work and what your abilities will be. And then you walk to the edge of a cliff, and you can see this massive landscape unfold out ahead of you. And you start to understand how complex and how deep this game could potentially go. And it's a little bit overwhelming, right? Because if you have a depth, but it's almost incomprehensibly deep, then you experience a sense of wonder, right? It's your sense of wonder comes out of the fact that you are experiencing something much larger than you could possibly imagine has actually existed, right? So a lot of games now are pushing that with open worlds and large expanses, and the fact that you can see a mountain far away and actually walk towards it and climb that mountain and see what's on top. And sometimes there's going to be something interesting there, and it's a little bit overwhelming. Like it's sort of curiosity to the extreme, and you end up with wonder, which is a great experience to give a player to bring them into your games, to sort of immerse them into your game. You mix that with fear, you have sort of a fearful, overwhelming, like this is more than I can possibly deal with sort of situation. You get what we refer to as awe. So you start with curiosity, right? So you sort of conceal and reveal. You exploit curiosity in the interest of coming in. They sort of come in with a bare level of curiosity, see what's inside your game. You give them a taste of it, and then you start to take away some of that and give them something to entice them forward, to keep them curious about moving forward, a mystery to solve, and so on. And then you start to unravel the complex pieces, whether it's the narrative or the gameplay, which provide that complexity, that depth that they're going to explore, and overwhelm them to the point of wonder. And maybe if they're fearful, they get a sense of awe, a good fear, right? Not necessarily like fear because I can't possibly do it, but fear in the sense of sort of a respectful fear, like I've really got to figure this out if I'm going to get there. And you get a sense of awe around your game. And so if you can achieve that, it is a very powerful thing to bring to a player, to immerse them into your world. So if there's anything that's close to a sort of well-accepted, well-defined, a lot of what I've said is sort of arguable in many cases, and it depends on who you're going to talk to, because they might not agree entirely with the way these things are defined or the way they're laid out. Flow is one of those that almost everybody is kind of getting behind and rallying behind, because it comes out of positive psychology, and it seems to be true, right? We started to see it in a lot of games. We can see it in the way players play games, and this is the notion that the challenge matches your skill. Okay? So this kind of goes with mastery. It goes with immersion, with the growing complexity of the game that you're being revealed to. But this has to do with how you feel about the game, right? And so, when you first come to the game, you have no skill. And so the challenge should actually be relatively low to match that. But as you start to get more and more mastery, as you start to understand more of the complexity of the system, then the challenge should grow to match that. And what you see here is that there's sort of this line along the side. So we've got skills along the bottom, and we've got challenge going vertically, and we create a graph, right? And so as long as we're kind of staying along the center lane here, then our skill matches our challenge and we're good to go. But if our challenge becomes too high, it develops anxiety, and we start to stress out, and we feel like we're overwhelmed and we're not going to be able to actually meet the challenge that we're faced with. On the other hand, if the challenge is too low, we become bored, and it's hard to care, or we just do it because we're doing it, and it's not that interesting. And so as we're capturing mastery, as we're capturing these complex systems, we also need to understand how the player is going to grow while they play our game, so that we don't keep the challenge at the same level and their skill grows and they work their way into boredom, and maybe the only reason that they're going to finish the game is because the narrative is they want to see how it ends, right? That's the only thing that we've got going for us. is the curiosity to see to the end, but there's nothing else there. And so if you stay within the flow state, turns out that this is a very addictive state. Sometimes you will find this when you are perfectly matched in the challenge to your skill, then you can start to work on something and you can forget time. You can get so focused, you can get so into the activity because your brain is enjoying it. You have all the energy you need to solve it, and you're just there. And so when games capture that, you can find people playing games for far longer than they probably should be, which is a good reason to build in breaks into your game. If you've managed to master the ability to match the skill to the challenge, and we'll look at some of the ways that we can play with the dynamical systems to do that, then you get that right. You can addict your players enough, and so it's worth maybe considering the safety of your player in that sense. The other thing you'll notice here is that it's not a perfect line, right? This is actually a space, and there's kind of a curviness to this line, and this curviness we'll come back to is kind of a model of a tempo and a rhythm to the game, right? So you can have challenges which are maybe pushing it in terms of being a little too high, right? That your character is going to get a little too anxious, and often we see this in terms of boss battles, right? So boss battles kind of push the limit, and we get to a boss that we might actually have to play against that boss 2 or 3 times before we beat them, because they're maybe at the high end of our skill level, and so we get a lot of anxiety going in there. It starts to push us that way, and it's okay to have a little bit of anxiety, right? Because it's sort of fun, right? You go in and you're like, I don't know if I can actually do this, and then you do it, and you get this sense of accomplishment, and it's amazing. And then maybe after that, you bring in, the challenge is lower, right? You go into after you beat a boss, you go back to sort of normal fights, and it's almost boring, but it's kind of relaxing too. That you still have to think about the fight. You can't just ignore it completely, but you get to settle in and say, look at how good I've gotten. Right now, I can beat all these kinds of low-level minions or whatever without even thinking about it. And then you come back to the next boss battle, and it's high anxiety again. So we don't have to just stay at a steady state of constant flow. We can actually move up and down and allow the player to experience a little bit of anxiety and maybe even a little bit of boredom or relaxation, if it's brief boredom, just for a small amount of time. One of the ways that we can help the players do kind of all of this to develop their skills, to start to build in the mastery, to explore the space, is that we need to let them know that experimentation is encouraged. So if we were to look at a complex system like a nuclear power plant, that's kind of high anxiety, and we really don't want people to be experimenting with it, right? We kind of want them to come in and know what they're doing and do exactly the things that they're supposed to do to keep the nuclear power plant running. Failure is bad here, right? And so, but on the other hand, if you had a game where you were playing around with a nuclear power plant and it was maybe silly when it exploded rather than devastating and reminds you of Chernobyl, then you might enjoy figuring out the weird ways that a power plant blows up, right? And so by doing so, you might start to play with these complex systems and understand where the inputs go and say, what happens if I turn this all the way up, or if I turn this all the way down? What happens if I play with these knobs here and those knobs there? And you could start to learn how the system works, and you might start to build an interesting mental model and maybe become a really good nuclear engineer if you needed to be. But your willingness to experiment, the understanding that you're in a sort of a safe place to play around because you won't lose a lot of time. There's nothing that actually catastrophic will happen. And so the better you can communicate when things are, say, critical to the game and when they aren't. And some things, it's okay to have places that are bad, right? So if you have the scary music and have a boss battle looming, you sort of prepare the player for coming into that. You get the fog, you get the lighting, the dramatic lighting, you start to get the creepy music. The player knows it's serious, right? And so now maybe they're not coming in experimenting. They know, I need to use all the skill that I've mastered so far. But in the other places where, say, you're out in the world and you're sort of facing a bunch of minions, you kind of know, well, it's not that serious. I'm not going to get thrown, I'm not going to lose a massive fight. I'm not going to lose a lot of time either. I didn't work my way up to this major area that I need to be concerned with. I can play around with things and see what happens if I do this, or see what happens if I do that. And so you can start to communicate with the player by just using, the effects of the world, or other kinds of feedback to let them know, or just, when did you last get a save point, to say you're in a safe place to start experimenting, to start playing around with things. And some of it could be the playfulness of the effects itself, right? So we talked about, you could have a playful sort of nuclear simulator, right? Like this is a playful diagram. We could play in this space without feeling like it's a very serious game, and it sort of encourages that level of experimentation. So it can look serious potentially too, and still be risk-free. So if it's well known, again, this comes with the framing and the way that you position the player within the space, and how they're working with it. If they know, say in a Dark Souls game or even Call of Duty, technically we're in a war zone, or we're in sort of the dark and heavy foreboding Dark Souls kind of world, we know that death isn't really permanent, right? And so it's certainly contextualized. We sort of have our character in that space. They will die, they will lose out, but you don't lose a whole lot, right? And so you can either come in and say, I'm gonna just play the game a specific way because it worked pretty well for me the last time, or you can come in and say, I'm gonna try a new gun, because what's the worst that happens? I die within 3 minutes or even 30 seconds or whatever of trying the game, but I want to see how this gun works out. I want to see how it feels to play with that. Or in Dark Souls, you might try different weapons or different skills or something. There are serious games now that actually exist with the idea that there's a trainer there. So this has not taken place really in commercial games that I'm aware of, that you will play a game, something will go bad, and you'll have somebody actually explain what you did wrong, right? Some expert will come along and tell you. Now you could have this in, say, League of Legends or something like that, where somebody who's much better than you in your guild or in your party can actually explain to you what it is you did wrong about your jungling or whatever, and tell you how to do it better. And of course, people in the chat space will always tell you when they're strangers, and get angry at you in the middle of the game. But there are situations where, say, the military and other kinds of serious training, like medical emergency and so on, where they can, or flight simulators as well. So you'll have expert pilots watch a novice pilot on a flight simulator, where again it's contextualized, but it's risk-free. They can usually experimentation isn't encouraged. You're actually guided through that kind of process. But if you've made a mistake, somebody can see what you did wrong and explain it to you, and so you're really within kind of a game-like space. But you're able to learn from that through that scenario. Now, what could be really exciting in the future of video games themselves is to actually give some advice in, especially the more complicated games, to say, well, you could have tried to do this, and to actually help players become better simply by playing the game, and then having sort of an expert system within the AI or in the game that helps them get through that. Okay, so let's come back. So we did a little diversion there on the ways that we can let the player experience the mastery, the immersion, the flow. And then there's also this aspect of the personal and social. So players come to your game for many reasons, but usually to be entertained, right? There are now games that are not necessarily entertaining. They are sort of educational, or really educational in the sense that you learn something you maybe didn't want to learn, in the way that sometimes you watch a documentary and you learn something you didn't want to learn, but maybe it was necessary to learn it, right? And sometimes that's true of many things, right? You learn more about the world. It's not always peachy keen, and it's important that we learn that the world's not always peachy keen. Sometimes with games it's harder, because we sort of still associate games with being purely entertainment and escapism and all of that. But that's where we come to the personal aspect. So, if you communicate clearly to some degree with the way you framed your game, that your game is serious, like you've got a Papers, Please game where it's kind of overwhelming and you get a little bit like a dark, foreboding sense out of it, or Senua's Sacrifice, Hellblade. Those kinds of games are not necessarily rewarding, but very interesting and very playable anyway. But given that, the personal aspect here means that you, and I'll take the traditional sense of a player playing for entertainment and playing for mastery, then this is the point at which achievements work, right? So achievements come in and tell a player, hey, you did something cool, and you unlocked an achievement on Xbox that says you did something cool, or you have various like metrics. So the Mad Max game has a legend achievements, I think they're called, or something like that, where after you've bashed into 50 cars, you earn an extra award, and you get like some extra things that you can use on your character that way. But it's also like, hey, you did some cool stuff. Here's a reward for you for that. That's not even just an achievement. It's actually something with endogenous value. And so it's good to think about your players in that sense. It's good to think about your players to make sure that they, will take breaks from your game. You don't want to make your game entirely addictive. You don't want to pull all the money out of the players. But you also kind of want to remind them of their successes, remind them of where they were, even just by bringing in old and original, so tutorial level characters, or send them back to starting locations and let them see how far they've come while playing your game and how exciting it's been that they've done that. And then on the social side, you can give your player kind of almost the same thing, except now it's not so much chatting here and the kind of the social the heart from Richard Bartle. It's actually your ability to share what's happening. So you can go into photo mode and capture a really cool image from wherever it is you are within the game, and it's really great marketing material anyway. Or you can share the fact that you did score an achievement, that you 100% of the game, that you did something cool, that you had the ability to do a replay, for instance, is maybe something that is critical in many games, where if it's possible to do something with skill, then the ability to go back 30 seconds, capture a movie of what that was, and then be able to save out that movie can be pretty awesome, right? And it's something you can share out. So Overwatch does a great job of this. They show play of the game, and even if you weren't the one that was play of the game that everybody got to see at the end of a match, you can still go back and save out videos of what you did that you thought was cool at some point and share it with people. And so these kinds of affordances within the game really allow that other part of the player experience to exist, and it's not divorced from these other three items: the mastery, the immersion, the flow. It's reinforcing them. It's actually when they've mastered something, when they got into the flow and did something really cool, or when they discovered some amazing part of the game that they really just have to tell people about because it's kind of awesome. Then you can give that to them, and of course you can remind them that they did that by giving them an achievement that they found something really cool about the game.